Good evening, friends. Welcome. This is a very special occasion for our congregation and for the leadership of our congregation, for our ministers, to welcome the one and only Imam Feisal Abdurrauf, the most progressive Imam of its time. I will give you a little background on him after I read some verses from the Quran. So I'm going to start, and this brings back all my childhood memories. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. This is the Arabic version that I grew up, that I read 5 times a day during my prayer. And Imam will go into more details and translate that for you later. Now about Imam Feisal on the fight against ISIS and extremists. Imam Feisal Abdurrauf is a chairman of Cordoba Initiative, an independent multinational project that works to reconnect the Muslim world in the West. In 1997, Imam Feisal founded the American Society of Muslim Advancement, ASMA, the first Muslim organization committed to bringing American Muslim and non-Muslim together through programs in academia, policy, current affairs, and culture. He served as the Imam of the Masjid al-Farah in New York City for 30 years. Currently, he sits on the Board of Trustees of Islamic Center of New York. Imam Feisal is the author of many published books, most recently, Moving the Mountain, which will be for sale this evening. So please make sure you buy a copy. I have several copies, and I love reading it again and again. A New Vision of Islam in America. That's the part of that book. Most recently, Moving the Mountains, A New Vision of Islam in America. Imam Feisal has been the recipient of several awards, including being ranked among the 100 most influential people of the world by Time magazine, top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy, and top 50 Arabs by the Middle East magazine. Now, with that said, I want to tell you a little personal story of how things work in a mysterious way. In 1977, when Colin and I got married, me being from the Muslim faith, Colin being brought up Episcopalian, of course, for me, as I was brought up 20 generations of imams, I could not have done that. Even love conquers everything, and the love was overwhelming between the two of us, but I needed Colin to be invited to the religion that I grew up with. So what did we do? There was only at that time one and only mosque in Washington, D.C., which we traveled to. And the wonderful imam at the time who signed our papers and gave Colin the name Abdullah was, ironically and mysteriously, Imam Faisal's father, which I did not know that until a few years ago when I met Imam and Daisy and we were talking, and he said, what year was that? I said, 1977, we went to Washington, D.C., and there was this wonderful Imam, and he married us. And, of course, it was the wonderful Imam's father. Plus, in my life, coming from many generations of Imams and being the daughter of Imam, the most progressive Imam that I have met after my father, who has been to this congregation 4 times, giving sermons, giving speeches, is the one and only Imam Feisal. With that, I welcome the most progressive Imam of our century.
Thank you, Latifa. You have a unique way of introducing people, and I've never been introduced before in my life in quite the same way or with the same élan. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, brothers and sisters, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. As Muslims, we begin by usually saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, where we invoke the name, in the name of the Creator of God, the All-Merciful, the All-Compassionate. Latifa recited for you one of the surahs or chapters of the Quran, which is commonly used. So the chapter which she just read is the chapter which is called Surah Al-Ikhlas, which means the chapter of sincerity. But when it actually says the following. It says, in the name of God, the All-Merciful, the All-Compassionate. Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Say, He is God, one. God the Eternal. Does not give birth, nor was He begotten, and to Him nothing is like Him. So to a Unitarian audience which believes in the oneness of God, this is a very appropriate invitation, a very appropriate surah to pronounce. In fact, the late Sir Richard Burton, not the one who married Elizabeth Taylor, but the traveler who lived in the 1800s, has a very lovely translation of this particular surah, when he says, say He is God, one, God the sempiternal, He begetteth not, nor is He begot, and unto Him the like is not. As a Muslim, and the defining feature of Islam is, like Judaism, a strict monotheism, we therefore share an emphasis on the oneness of God, which is why the Unitarian tradition resonates very much with our theology. So I'm happy to be here again, happy to be welcomed by you, and thank you very much, Latifa, once more, and to all of you, Minister Paul and Victor and Colin and all of you of the board who very graciously piled me up with fantastic Afghan food hosted by Latifa, and thank you for inviting me again. The subject that I'm invited to speak to you about is the phenomenon of ISIS in Iraq. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or as has sometimes been called, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL. This phenomenon of ISIS or ISIL is fundamentally a result of the geopolitical vectors that have been acting in the area of Iraq and Syria over the last several years, especially with the start of the Arab Spring and the desire of many people in that region of the world to establish more democratic regimes or regimes that fulfill the aspirations of the people, not only for self-governance, but also to have a polity in which they can thrive. Unfortunately, much of what has happened since the invasion of Iraq and the elimination of the regime of Saddam Hussein, and what we, the American government, has done in trying to put together a democratic regime, has resulted in a policy in Iraq where the majority of the power has lied with the Iraqi Shia community. In Iraq, or what has been known as Iraq, there are three major constituencies or demographics, if I call them that way for lack of a better term. You have the Arabs and you have the Kurds. The Kurds are primarily in the north. And you have the Arab Shia and the Arab Sunnis. So what's interesting is that the Kurds are also Sunnis in terms of their particular persuasion of Islam, but the Arabs are split between the Arab Shia and the Arab Sunni. Under Saddam Hussein, the minority Sunnis really ruled and had all the power and the wealth. It was really more the Ba'athist regime rather than based upon a Sunni identification. And the Shias were very much oppressed, as were the Kurds under the Saddam regime. So when the recent regime developed after the removal of Saddam Hussein, is that you wind up having a de facto situation where the Kurds more or less had not a totally independent state, but as close to an independent state as possible within the geopolitical structure of Iraq. And then within the rest of Iraq properly, you had a regime which was dominated by Shias and where the Sunnis felt relatively marginalized. As I said earlier in our board meeting to members of the board over dinner, most conflict in the world that centers around, most modern day conflicts are really around conflict between two parties, two groups, over issues of power, or a sense by one of the parties that they don't have their equitable share in the power pie, and or in the economic pie. So if you take, for example, the issue of the problem in Ireland until 9/11 between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants, it really had nothing to do with matters of theology or matters of differences of theology between Protestant theology and Catholic theology. It was a group, the Irish Catholics, who felt they did not have an equitable share as Irish Protestants in power and economic well-being. And you can have this in any country in the world, between any two groups. So you can create conflicts between any type of differentiation, based upon any identity tag differentiation. So you'll have, let's say, conflicts between blacks and whites in the United States of America, for example, on the basis of skin coloring or race. You can have problems like in Rwanda between Hutus and Tutsis, both of whom are black, both of whom are African, and yet, because of this tribal differentiation, you can have conflicts around that which can get extremely violent. You can have problems like in Ireland, or like today in Iraq and in Syria, between Shias and Sunnis. It doesn't really matter how the differentiation is. It can be on basis of religion, sectarian difference, ethnic difference, national difference, tribal difference. Maybe in Afghanistan between the Pashtuns and the Azeris, or the Uzbekis, or whatever they are, the Tajiks. So you can have conflicts between any variety, and we can create any variety of conflicts. I mean, we have rivalry between, let's say, Oxford and Cambridge, or between Harvard and Yale, or between, the Philadelphia Eagles and the New York Giants, or the Jets. There are favorite rivalries that we have created in our societies. But this is essentially what gave rise to ISIS. So ISIS began as an attempt by the Sunnis to claim what they felt to be their equitable share, which is why some of the ex-Saddam Hussein regime members actually participated and helped initially to develop and grow the strength of what later became known as ISIS. But there are a few other strands and through other vectors that also have given it that particular shape. One is that throughout Islamic history, or certainly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad was one of the few prophets, in addition to David and Solomon, who effectively were rulers in their time. They acted as kings. They had political power, in addition to being prophets. So they were prophet kings. By the end of his life, the Prophet Muhammad was effectively the ruler of Arabia, and he set in motion a movement that within a century really conquered vast territories, most of the known world of that time. And with that, although there was political rivalry from within, basically the Muslims, regardless of whether it was the Umayyads or the Abbasids or who ruled where, in what port, essentially governed over that region of the world, and developed a civilization and translated all the known works. And Muslims they basically assimilated everything into their heritage. They translated the Greek works of the Greek philosophers and advanced philosophy. They took science and mathematics and astronomy from India and developed mathematics. Even the notion of the numbering system which we use today is called the Arabic numeral system, as you know, because before that in Europe you used to write numbers in the Roman system. So 100 will be C, and 355 multiplied by 129. You couldn't do that in Roman numerals as easily as you can with the Arab numbering system. So the invention of the numbering system, even the branch of algebra is from the word al-jabr, which means, jabr means to force, and al-jabr means the science of forcing the answer to a particular question. That's why we have the word algebra. And many of the names in English which begin with L, A-L, or even in Spanish for that matter, come from Arabic words like alkali in chemistry, or alkaline, that's an Arabic word. So many, even the word for university and college come from Arabic words, actually. The word kulliya, which means the study of everything, and to have kulliya of fiqh and kulliya of sharia and kulliya of language and kulliya of theology, became known as the college in English. Kulliya became the word college, the college of philosophy, the college of fine arts, and so forth. And it began from a mosque. A mosque is from the word masjid, sajda. Sajda means to perform prostration. Masjid means a place of prostration. And the word masjid itself moved from Arabia through Spain to become mezquita, masjid, masjid, mesquite, mezquita. And from mesquita to France became mosque, and from mosque became mosque. That's why it's written Q-U-E at the end rather than M-O-S-K, because it evolved. There's a storyline behind the way the word itself developed, just like Isa, Iesu, and then Iesu became, written with a J, and then becomes Jesus in Spain, becomes Yesu in Germany, and Jesus in England, because we pronounce the J as a J rather than a Y, like in Germany. So there's a storyline to how these names, as they moved through Europe, and how these ideas even developed. So the idea of a masjid in a community began to have other activities surrounding it. So you would have a masjid Jamia. Jamia means a collection of things. So you'd have, adjacent to the mosque, you'd have a madrasa, a school. You might have a soup kitchen, what we call today a soup kitchen. You would have a hospital or a hospice, Beit al-Shifa, or house of... And so the notion of a masjid jamia, a mosque that would agglomerate around it a number of activities. I mean, even many people would call it the jamia instead of the mosque. We use the word jamia in many Muslim countries. And from jamia, developed out of jamia. So the collection of everything. Jamia is mosque, and jamia now means university, because it is the collection of everything, the universe of everything. And if you look at the word university, it's from the word universe. So there is this historical confluence and exchange between Islamic culture and what Muslims developed, and Islamic civilization, as people call it, and Western civilization, which many people are unaware of. And today we think that Western civilization and Islamic civilization are something fundamentally polarized and existentially in opposition with each other. When we examine it more closely, we realize that there's so much that we have in common, and so much which we have exchanged and learned from each other's tradition. So, but going back to the point I was making, is that when the Muslims then absorbed from all of these societies and made it their own and even expanded upon it, but later on we lost that heyday. So there is a certain element within the Muslim collective consciousness for a desire to regain what we had lost. And this is what supports the notion of what is called a caliphate or an Islamic state. It is a desire to reestablish something which flows from our theology, from our heritage, from the greatness of the peak that we have once had and lost. So that is a driver among a certain segment within the Muslim collective consciousness around the world, which fuels the aspiration for an Islamic state or an Islamic way of living or an Islamic ideal. The Christian idea of building a shining city on the hill, that biblical term which I'm sure you're all familiar with, translated into the Muslim vocabulary is the idea of the ideal Islamic state. The ideal of a caliphate, because the word caliphate or caliph comes from the word khalifa in Arabic, which the Quran uses to describe when God created Adam. When God created Adam and thereby created humankind, God describes in our book, the Quran, the creation of humankind as the creation of a khalifa. That we are created to be God's khalifa. So the notion of a caliphate is not just an idea of maintaining something which the Prophet himself established, but it also has deep resonance in the Muslim consciousness to the notion of something which speaks to the highest demand of what we as human beings were created for to put on earth. So when you say you're trying to re-establish or establish a khalifa, or to re-establish a caliphate, you are capitalizing on that sentiment, which is what is very easy to draw support from 1.5 billion Muslims around the world, to be able to collect a few thousand people in the world by putting a very effective internet blog type of thing, which capitalizes on this sentiment, you're going to grab a number of people. So that is part of the brilliance of what you might call the marketing strategy of ISIS, that they've capitalized on this sentiment that exists as a recruiting method to recruit people who have an aspiration to establish the greatness of Islam and to establish a state that exhibits the ideal traits of what the Prophet himself represented. But ISIS actually came out of the reality that the Sunnis were marginalized by the Maliki regime in Iraq. And when you overlay on that the rivalry in the Middle East, the two big vectors that are playing in the Middle East are Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia waves or champions the Sunni flag and has a long, deep-seated animosity to Shia and Shiaism, more than even other parts of the Arab world. I mean, I come from Egypt, and at one time the Egyptians were Shias under the Mamluks, and we have many grave sites of Sayyidina al-Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet's head is said to be buried there, and many members of the Prophet's descendants are buried there. So we have a natural love for the house of the Prophet and the family of the Prophet in Egypt. But the Saudis and the Wahhabi philosophy has a particular antipathy towards Shiaism, and they have supported Sunni anti-Shia sentiment. And of course, Iran sees itself as the defenders of Islam at one level, but also the defenders of the Shia faith and global community worldwide. So this is a very important factor in interpreting or unpacking the geopolitical vectors that are acting in the scene. So when you saw what happened in Bahrain, for example, you have a Sunni minority ruling over a Shia majority who feel that they don't have their fair share of the political and economic pie in Bahrain, and they try to express their desire to have a correction, to use a stock market term, and it was put down with the help of the Saudis, for example. So you can see in these types of activities signs of how these forces are playing. The desire for an Islamic state and for a nation state which calls itself Islamic, which aspires to establish the values of the faith. It's something which is widespread in the Islamic world, and this gave rise to what we call Islamic political parties, which began actually in the late 19th century. So these movements. They began with the end of the empire model, end of the Ottoman Empire, and the beginning of nation-state models in that region of the world. And out of that came the Muslim Brotherhood and the rise of many other so-called Salafi parties, which are basically varieties of political parties which consider themselves as religious political parties whose vision and aspiration is to establish an Islamic state. However, one of the things that we have learned from the brief sojourn of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is that when you're in power and you're trying to actually, if you don't have a very clear, cogent, well-defined, well-expressed idea of what you mean by that, when you're in power, you'll start be thrashing around without knowing how to coherently define what that means in terms of a constitution, in terms of, you know, the various institutions of power. So when you're constructing a government, you know, in looking at what happened in Egypt, you can see that there was really a failure of that kind of analysis, like what we had when our founding fathers established this nation, crafted the concept of a constitution, which took some years, like what, 8-9 years after the Declaration of Independence, wrote about the separation of powers doctrine, as we call it today. And if you read the Federalist Papers, as I'm sure many of you have, and the writings of people on both sides of this divide as to the balance of powers and the relationships between different agencies of government and how power is to be expressed, you can see that insufficient time and insufficient analysis at the level of what I call a Federalist paper type analysis was exhibited in the development of such concepts within the nation building process, whether it was in Iraq, in Egypt. But because of what happened and because of the forcible removal of power by say, Sisi, the current Egyptian leadership, against the Muslim Brotherhood, created also a sense of frustration, a sense that that due process was not used to remove those in political power. And I myself predicted that you would see more violence done in the name of Islam as a result of that. Because one of the advantages or purposes of democracy, or one of those to define even democracy, is a peaceful, non-violent change of the political regime. I mean, before democracy, if you want to change the government, you had to basically kill the rulers. The whole idea of a democratic regime is that you create a peaceful, non-violent process by which the governed can change the governors, those who are governing. And when you halt that process, as what happened in Egypt, where you prevent the process of peaceful regime change, then those who want change will have to resort to violence. It's as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. And the moment this happened, you saw increased violence happening in the Sinai, increased incidents of violence, and the notion that those who aspire to establish something called an Islamic state would then resort and be recruited by people like ISIS. So ISIS capitalized also on the repression of legitimate sentiments in countries like Egypt towards the development or the establishment of a state that would putatively, ostensibly exhibit the kind of values that people aspire to have and see. I think that gives an idea as to the the proverbial witch's brew, as we would call it, around which some phenomenon like ISIS grew up and developed. For a time, they were supported by those who were supporting the Sunni, by the Saudis and those types of forces, until, like in the story of Frankenstein, the creation began to bite its creators. And I think that's a fair way to describe the phenomenon of ISIS. And ISIS was very effective in grabbing power, establishing themselves in certain territory in both Iraq and in Syria, because Iraq effectively, until the most recent change, the government was predominantly Shia, and in Syria, where the ruler, the Assad regime, is Alawi, which is considered like a branch of the Shia, and therefore the desire of people like Turkey, who are Sunnis, and the Turkish leadership and the Saudis to see a regime change in Syria, and their frustration that the Obama administration did not actually remove the Assad regime, plus the sense of Sunni marginalization in Iraq also fueled the desire to support or to weaken the Shia dominance in the region. And you can very much see in the behavior of the current Turkish regime towards ISIS the ambivalence between these different vectors that are pulling very often in opposing directions. How do we solve this? That's the work that I've been focusing on for the last dozen years. That's the work which has to be done, in my opinion, not only regionally but globally. Because, in my judgment, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Syria, while it is limited to that region, is also, to some extent, a function of a particular kind of global world order, or the lack thereof. The current, it's not independent, I should rather say, it's not totally independent from the dynamics which is occurring between the United States and its allies and Russia. By which I say, if you're trying to solve the Iranian problem, the Iran nuclear problem, or even Syria, Syria has been a client state of Russia. Iranians have a good relationship with Russia. And if you want to motivate Iran or motivate Syria, and Syria is a client state of Russia, to have a relationship with Russia where you have a combined sense and sensibility of how you want to structure the global world order is going to be very important to shape the context within which you can solve these things. For instance, if you want to solve the current tension between the United States and Iran, the issue of nuclear power, having Russia on your side is going to be very important. Just as the United States needs the Saudis and the Turks to help solve the problem in Syria and the problem in Iraq, you will need the support of all of these. So I think what we need today is to look at a global world order, which I think has not yet been developed and needs to be developed. Analogous to what happened after World War I, World War II rather. If you look at, the one way to explain this is by means of the following analogy. If you look at what the Allies did to Germany at the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and compare it to what the Allies did with Germany at the end of World War II, Germany and Japan for that matter. The end of World War I, the Allies basically imposed onerous demands for reparation on the Germans, resulting in hyperinflation, resulting in great instability, and historians have even plausibly argued that out of this instability came Hitler. After World War II, we created the Marshall Plan. We created a Europe-wide, continent-wide security arrangement called NATO. Germany and Turkey, that were part of the Axis, now we talk Axis of evil, at that point, at that time, I'm sure the Westerners considered Germany and Turkey as part of that Axis. But the Axis powers became part of NATO. So we created a new world order where the security arrangements included Germany and Turkey, were included as part of NATO, where security arrangements were made with Japan, where their economies were helped to be developed through the Marshall Plan, so much so that within 30 years, the German economy and the Japanese economy became among the most powerful economies in the world. What was not done after the end of the Cold War is to create a late 20th century or 21st century version of NATO, or rather expanded NATO to include Russia. So we need an international security world order that includes Russia as a stakeholder in it, rather than as seeing Russia as part of the opposition, and taking ex-Warsaw Pact nations, inviting them to join NATO, inviting them to become part of the European Union, and maintaining Russia as the existential other. This is the dynamic which has fueled the tension with the United States and the Western allies and Russia. I believe what should have happened is that Russia should have been made part of NATO, or recraft NATO to include Russia as a fundamental stakeholder and all the ex-Warsaw Pact nations into it, and then expand into a global world order, because now you have to worry about China. And China has been pushing its weight around in East Asia. As you may have heard, the conflicts with the Philippines, with Vietnam, on some rights to some islands and so forth, because there's potentially oil underneath it. So we need an international security arrangement that globalizes the concept of NATO at one hand. And with that in mind, you can then address the other issues, and you have invested parties to then do the same at a regional level. Should have a regional level security arrangement in let's say, the Middle East. And you'd have to then get the Iranians and the Saudis to also to create a security arrangement within it. And then to have a way by which people aspire for the things that they aspire to. Because at the end of the day, the Egyptians, the Tunisians, the whatever they want, basically want what we in America call life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness issues. Most people will trade the opportunity for democracy for financial well-being, which is why many people go to the Gulf countries, to Dubai, to Qatar, to Kuwait, etc., even to Saudi Arabia, to work, because if you get a good job, that's what basically most people want. And that's the desire which most people have in those countries. But going back again to the source of conflict as being the desire for people, groups of people, to have their fair share of the political power pie and the economic power pie, is at its source the way by which you're going to solve many of these problems, as we solved it in Ireland by giving the Irish Catholics their fair share in the political space and the economic space. So with this introduction, which has been kind of an attempt to speak in simple terms about matters which are very complex at some level, highly convoluted and interknitted like a bowl of yarn that is all threaded and knotted with each other, trying to unknot them and unpack them to you without hopefully having confused any of you. And right now I'd welcome any questions from the audience. Thank you very much, and may God bless you all.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. The question that I have is, can you explain to us the work that you've been doing and define the Islamic State, or on defining the Islamic State, that you've been recently involved?
Yes, I can. It's going to be part of a book that will be published coming out in May of 2005 by Palgrave Macmillan. In essence, the group of scholars that we put together chose to define, first of all, we looked at the way the word Islamic State has been defined. It is not about a demographically Muslim state, which is what many people will say. I mean, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, are all members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, as it's called, right, OIC. But Turkey, Indonesia are secular states. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. Pakistan is a republic. And yet all of them consider themselves Islamic states. And yet there are fundamental differences. So they are demographically majority Muslim, yes, which doesn't tell you anything about how the state is constructed. So the scholars said, okay, let us focus on what a good Islamic governance, a governance that accords with Islamic principles means. There were differences of opinion, of course. Some people said the state must declare Islam as a state religion, or must declare, declarations are very important. Our scholars from Turkey and Indonesia, who of course need to look to their political masters, said no. Declarations mean nothing. A state is not a speaker. A state is not a real being. It's a fiction, like a corporation is a fiction. The state is not going to, the scholars who said, no, it must declare, as a Muslim you have to say the Shahada, this is what makes you a Muslim. So a state has its own Shahada. The other scholars said, no, but the state is not going to be resurrected and judged by God on the day of judgment and punished with heaven and hell. It's a total fiction. It's a way of speaking. Anyhow, there was difference of opinion on declarations, but they unanimously agreed on what a state should deliver. Although the majority of scholars said that the state should acknowledge God as sovereign, which to me as an American says, hey, the United States acknowledges God as sovereign. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with rights, with inalienable or unalienable rights, which means the rights inherent in us because we are human, given to us by God, by the Creator, among which are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And as you read the Declaration of Independence, you talk about the providential Lord, the providential God. So God is mentioned in the Declaration many, many times. So by that standard, the United States is, from a declaration point of view, an Islamic state, because it, acknowledges the existence of a God and a Creator. But in terms of deliverables, which they unanimously agreed, a state has to deliver justice. And they divided justice into political justice, economic justice, justice in the courts, and the delivery of what are called the 6 objectives of Islamic law. It's called the Maqasid al-Sharia in Arabic. About 8 centuries ago, the scholars of Islam analyzed the law and said all of the law has as its purpose the protection and furthering of 6 objectives, which are actually rights. The objectives are the protection of life, the protection of religion, the protection of property, the protection of family, the protection of intellect, and the protection of honor. And I myself have written an article that was published by the Law Review of the University of, I forgot it now, in Wisconsin. Minnesota. Anyway, in which I talk about this and show that life, the original declaration talked about life, liberty, and property. And then property was added to pursuit of happiness in our Declaration of Independence. So life is common to the maqasid, the 6 maqasid, property, or the original one, or liberty, which I map to honor, the concept of honor, and pursuit of happiness. What do we do to pursue happiness? We pursue property, we pursue our intellectual pursuits, we pursue the idea of family, and we pursue our religious beliefs, whatever you want to believe and practice it freely. So through that, you can see how the construct of the American Declaration of Independence expresses the values of how an Islamic state should be defined in terms of the rights and obligations which a state should help its citizens fulfill. The first question is, that the Quran require Muslims to punish infidels for being infidel? The answer is no. Not at all. In fact, the Quran is quite explicit. In several places, God says that we created humankind, we created human life and human death in order to test you which ones of you are best in action. The notion of there shall be no compulsion in religion. These are fundamental Quranic commandments. The fact of the matter that there are many or a number of Islamic or so-called Muslim governments which violate these principles doesn't mean that that is what Islam actually preaches. In fact, until the mid-20th century, Egypt, where I grew up, had long historical communities of Copts who were Christians before the time of Muslims in Egypt. We had an Egyptian Jewish community which were there before the Muslims and before the Christians came to Egypt. We had Jews in Egypt continuously since the time of well, maybe not when Moses left Egypt, but then they came back and they conquered it. But certainly since the time of Abraham, and when Joseph came to Egypt and brought his brothers into Egypt, and Egypt basically had the majority of the Jewish community at the time. So we have long-standing communities, multi-ethnic, multi-faith communities in most of our societies. But to me, I point the finger of blame at the concept of a nation-state identity. I mean, Turkey, the Ottomans ruled over Turks, over Greeks, over Persians, over Bulgarians, over Albanians, over Arabs, over all kinds of people. They ruled over Muslims, over Jews, over Christians, until today. The Orthodox Patriarch is in Constantinople, in Istanbul. In my opinion, although many Turkish friends find it politically incorrect to agree with me, Ataturk, or the time of Ataturk, where Turkey changed from the empire model to the nation-state model, with the result that there was no space for Greeks. Greeks massively were forcibly evacuated from Turkey, from what is currently Turkey. There's a massive, like what happened in India and Pakistan. So the notion of a nation-state, where the state has to be uniformly all Turkish, or all Muslim, or all Arabs, or all Egyptian, is one of the biggest curses that befell humanity in this last century, which unfortunately many people in the Muslim world have adopted. And what we need to do, if there's any value in going back to a caliphate, is going back to a multicultural, multi-faith, multi-religious form of governance, which we have to recreate again. Thank you. This is why the role of the United States is very important. We live in a very highly shrunk world. We live in a highly interconnected world. We live in a world where there are various institutions through which power is deployed. There's political power, there's military power, there's economic power. And there's the power of persuasion through the media and through the mindsets which people have. The United States has enormous power by virtue of the fact that it has the largest military, it has the largest market, its currency is the global currency. Oil is traded in US dollars. In many countries, even in Russia, probably people prefer, when people want a safe haven, they convert their rubles into dollars, or they convert their Argentinian, pesos into dollars. So this gives the United States a lot of power. The United States has a lot of soft power, the power of persuasion. And this is why, as much as I, in many ways, agree or want and support Obama, I fault our administration, both Bush and Obama administrations, for a lack of a sufficiently nuanced, in-depth, coherent projection of US power and policy in shaping the events around the world. So I believe that even Russia wants the United States to do something differently. If you read what Vladimir Putin said on October 24th in a speech in Vidal, he was talking about this end of what happened after the end of the Cold War and what happened, blah, 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 blah. If you read through the lines and you interpret it with an understanding of the big wave pictures that he's trying to portray, he is basically asking for a different world order. Are we hearing it? Are we hearing it, and are we responding to it adequately to the demand of the time? To date, I have not yet seen it. But is it doable? It is very doable. So, operationally and sequentially, America has to step up to the plate. Look, any person can go out and put his or her shingle out there and get a few thousand people to follow you. I remember back, what is it, in the 90s, was it, or the 80s, when this Jones massacre, where 234 or 243 people drank cyanide-laced something. You can get 200 people to follow you anywhere, to do anything. I mean, I remember I grew up in the 60s, for those of you who are of my generation. I couldn't figure out in Columbia University, where I went to as an undergraduate, why these upper-class, white, prosperous young men would have posters of Che Guevara on their dorms and sing about revolution and joining SDS, wanting to create revolution in America. And I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't understand rationally what it is. I believe, and there was a famous film, as those of you who remember, James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause. You'll always find in every society, even in a prosperous society like America, rebels without a cause, looking for a cause. If you give them a cause, you will rally all these people around you. And so the solution is that don't look at that as the problem. That is just to me, a secondary, tertiary level problem. It's like the suicide bombing. You want to end suicide bombing, don't try to worry about the people who are recruited to commit suicide bombing. Who are the people who are leading them and paying them to do it? It's their issue that has to be addressed. Once their issue is addressed, you won't have very many suicide bombers after that anymore. The issues of ISIS are local. ISIS actually began originally as a purely local phenomenon. They were attacking only people. They were interested only in grabbing territory in Iraq, fundamentally, and then in Syria. Their focus was, the famous expression, all politics is local. ISIS's politics was originally all local. It wasn't until the foreign forces began to attack them that they began calling then for attacks against Americans. And lone wolves attacks have all of a sudden begun to appear. But their focus was not really on that. And therefore, whatever happens here is going to have minimal impact, if any. But like what happens with everybody around the world, we have a saying in America, when a train leaves a station, everybody whose destination or whose purpose is to go somewhere where the train is going will jump on that train. So people will take advantage of whatever is happening in a particular place to their advantage. So if Bush and Cheney get punished, they'll say, see, they actually create torture. So this is why they had our guys in orange jumpsuits. That's why we have them in orange jumpsuits. So you will just sustain, they'll use it to sustain their issues. Until you go to the root cause, it'll just be a continuing echo and ricochet effect, back and forth, sustaining this, this dynamic.
Okay, thank you. Just two more questions. If you had the magical power, how would you orchestrate or architect a solution to the problem as you define it?
If I had a magic wand, I would I would look to a group of great political scientists. I'd establish a new world order, which included Russia, make Russia and China as important stakeholders in this international security arrangement, and then work on getting the Saudis and the Iranians together to address this issue. I would urge all countries to adopt a way by which every group entity will have its fair share, equitable share of. It's like what happened here. I came here in the 60s. It was a civil rights movement. There was the Black Panthers being violent. But when Johnson put together the Civil Rights Act and you had affirmative action, what happened? Gradually, we still have a race problem in America, but you don't see the level of violence that existed in the 60s. You don't have the same edginess as we had then. Why? Because we have affirmative action. We have made a conscious effort within, it may take 5, 10, 15 years, to bring in African Americans into education, to give them slots in jobs, to give them set-asides in government contracts and so forth. So, as again, you structure in each of these locations mechanisms by which people feel that they have a future, that they are stakeholders and have at least the opportunity to develop and have their fair share in the political power pie and in the economic power pie. And you have to use that kind of combination of affirmative action, let's go for lack of a better word, in each of these locations, and create a society where all its members feel they are stakeholders.
And finally, if Mohammed were to come back today.
If who?
Mohammed.
Right.
Were to come back today, how would he feel about ISIS? What would he say? That's one of the questions here. What can I tell you?
The same way Jesus would.
Okay, and on that note, I think we shall finish the questioning.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and God bless you all.